Hello students, well we've reached our last lecture on the 70s and the Reagan Revolution. Having survived the 1970s, I feel well qualified to speak on this subject. Now, when Richard Nixon took office as president, he really was determined to get the U.S. out of Vietnam. He didn't want the Vietnam War to destroy his presidency the way it had LBJ's. Um, but the strategies that he chose were controversial. He did steadily decrease the number of American troops in Vietnam in an attempt to turn the war over to South Vietnamese troops. But in order to support the South Vietnamese, Nixon thought it was necessary to expand the war into the neighboring countries of Cambodia and Laos because the major Viet Cong supply lines went through those countries. He announced this decision on television on April 30th, 1970, and immediately college campuses all over the country erupted in anti-war protests that turned very ugly. There was 4 days of rioting at Kent State University in Ohio. On May 4th, the National Guard had arrived at Kent State, and they were throwing tear gas canisters at a group of protesters, ordering them to disperse. The demonstrators were throwing the tear gas canisters back at the police and also throwing rocks at the National Guard, excuse me. And the National Guard snapped and opened fire on the students, resulting in four deaths. And only 11 days later, while the country was still reeling from the shock of Kent State, there's a group of demonstrators at Jackson State College, which is a historically black college in Jackson, Mississippi. And this protest, too, had turned somewhat ugly with the demonstrators throwing rocks at passersby. And so the police came in, and the police believed that they were taking sniper fire from a dorm window, and so they opened fire on the demonstrators and killed two students at Jackson State. So you see that Vietnam War protests were still a hugely inflammatory issue in the early 1970s. Now, Nixon, the Nixon administration did manage to get to the negotiating table with the North Vietnamese, and in January 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed, and basically this provided for all U.S. troops to be withdrawn from South Vietnam, and it was supposed to establish peace between the two countries, but part of the agreement was that the Viet Cong would continue to have bases in South Vietnam, and that was really a recipe for disaster. So soon, the Paris Peace Accords had been violated by both North and South Vietnam. But U.S. public opinion by this point in time was totally opposed to our having any further role helping the South Vietnamese. And so Nixon basically refused to return our troops there to support South Vietnam, which sank further and further into chaos until finally the North Vietnamese captured the entire country of South Vietnam, and in April 1975 took the capital city, Saigon. And there were very poignant and heartbreaking pictures as the last American personnel were evacuated from Saigon on helicopters of terrified South Vietnamese people clinging to the blades of the helicopters, desperately trying to get out of South Vietnam before it went communist. But it did go communist. Vietnam was reunited under the communist regime, and it still is an officially communist regime. So, according to Nixon, the U.S. had achieved peace with honor in Vietnam, but I think for the majority of American people, there was the humiliating consciousness that, in fact, we had been defeated. we hadn't met our objective in Vietnam, and that would contribute um, to the somewhat depressive mindset of the 1970s, as people wondered what it had all been for in the more than 50,000 Americans who had been killed in Vietnam. Talking about some achievements of the Nixon administration, and there were many. Even liberals had much to applaud in the policies of President Nixon. For example, although Nixon had, as you may remember, been extremely anti communist in his younger days, it was Nixon who actually opened diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China and even visited China in February of 1972. And that was the beginning of the trading relationship that we have now that's so very significant, resulting in so many of our goods that we buy at Walmart and other places being manufactured in the People's Republic of China. And so, really, Nixon was the one who opened relations with Communist China and also dramatically improved relationships with the Soviet Union. And a lot of this had to do with Nixon's national security advisor, later Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, who was really a brilliant intellectual who had come up with the idea of what was called détente, which basically meant that instead of trying to run the Soviet Union out of existence, the United States should simply accept that the Soviet Union was here to stay and should try to cooperate with it in a constructive way as much as possible. Kissinger's foreign policy was very pragmatic, very realistic, and somewhat effective, very effective in reducing the tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. For example, under Nixon, the first major arms control agreements were signed with the Soviet Unions that did reduce stockpiles of nuclear weapons. Richard Nixon also was responsible for creating the Environmental Protection Agency and OSHA, an organization or a federal government agency that monitors workplace safety. And in 1971, Nixon even went so far as to impose wage and price controls. That is, in certain sectors of industry and for certain products, Nixon put a cap on wages and on the prices that manufacturers could charge. A policy that would have made socialist Bernie Sanders very proud, I think. So, why did Nixon do all this? Well, perhaps because of his long conservative track record. He was the only one who could really manage to get away with this. If a Democratic president had tried to do it, you can bet there would have been major opposition. So Nixon was considered a very successful president when he ran for re-election in 1972 against the Democratic nominee, Senator George McGovern of South Dakota. And Nixon won in a huge landslide, one of the biggest electoral victories in American history. But in what seemed to be his hour of greatest triumph, it was the election of 1972 that really exposed the personality flaws in Richard Nixon that would ultimately bring his administration to an end. Nixon was paranoid. Nixon was suspicious. Nixon believed everybody was out to get him in the mass media, in the Washington establishment, and in the universities and so forth. And so Nixon created a group in the election called the Committee to Re-elect the President, better known as CREEP. And CREEP undertook what became known as the Dirty Tricks campaign. That is, they tried to influence even the Democratic primary elections by putting out lies and disinformation about the candidates and really smearing them. And also, it was revealed later that an enemies list was compiled in which Nixon listed his major enemies in the media, in big business, even in Hollywood. Paul Newman, the actor, was on the enemies list. Uh, and so you get a sense there of Nixon's paranoia, his feeling that no matter how far he had risen, um, somehow he still felt inferior or persecuted. Um, but the most notorious action that took place in the 1972 election was the burglary of the Democratic National Committee headquarters, which happened to be in a place called the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. Now, there was a subgroup under Creep that was known as the White House Plumbers, led by a man named G. Gordon Liddy. It was the Plumbers, as they were called, who carried out the most secretive operations for Creep. And so they broke into the Democratic National Committee headquarters, hoping to get their hands on documents, and were caught in the act and were arrested in the office of the DNC and put on trial. Now, it is clear that Nixon didn't actually order the burglary at the Watergate Hotel. He didn't know about it until afterwards. It was a case of some well-intentioned employees of his running amok. But he was the one that was paying, or his campaign was paying the plumbers. And it was Nixon who undertook a massive cover-up in which he basically supported the plumbers, gave them payments to keep silent so that they would not incriminate him or other White House staff. And the cover-up was quite successful at first. In fact, the story had almost faded from the national news media. But there were two reporters at the Washington Post, young reporters named Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, who kept the story alive. And it's very interesting. Bob Woodward had a secret informant at the FBI, a high-level FBI official, who in his published writings about this, Woodward identified only by the name Deep Throat. So Woodward would meet Deep Throat in parking garages in D.C., and Deep Throat would give him tips as to how to pursue his investigation. And he told Woodward, follow the money. In other words, find out who's giving these guys checks and trace it back to the White House. And so that's what Woodward and his partner Carl Bernstein did. A few years ago, the man who was Deep Throat revealed his identity. His name was Mark Felt. Recently died, but a real triumph for investigative journalism in showing the importance of newspapers in keeping a watchful eye on the government. So thanks to the efforts of Woodward and Bernstein, the scandal erupted again, and congressional hearings were held. And then a real bombshell emerged. In mid-1974, it became known that Nixon actually had been taping every conversation he had had in the Oval Office and all of his phone conversations. And so he had this hoard of secret tapes. And so the special prosecutor in the case wanted to get hold of the tapes. Nixon refused, and the case went to the Supreme Court, which ordered Nixon to release the tapes. And so at that point, knowing there was ample evidence on the tapes that showed that he was being covered up, the Congressional Committee voted articles of impeachment for Nixon. Now, Nixon knew he was going to be impeached and removed from office, and not wanting to endure that humiliation, he went on television on the evening of August 9th, 1974, and resigned the presidency. the first and only president to date ever to resign. And so, really, the story of Richard Nixon is almost like Shakespearean tragedy. You have a very gifted, very intelligent man who could have been one of the greatest presidents in American history, but who was brought to um, the utmost humiliation by the tragic flaws in his character. Well, at that point, the vice president, Gerald R. Ford, became president. And this was really a special case as well in American history. Nixon's original vice president was Spiro Agnew of Maryland, but Agnew had also had to resign because of corruption in October 1973. And so Nixon had appointed Ford, who was a longtime congressman from Michigan, uh, as his um, as his vice president. So that meant that Ford was actually the only president ever to serve who had never been elected to high national office, having been appointed vice president by Nixon. And he was a very well liked figure in Washington, very well respected, very soft spoken, and seemed to be the perfect man to bind up the wounds of the nation and bring healing. But Ford's popularity plummeted in September 1974 when he announced that he was issuing a full and complete unconditional pardon to Richard Nixon, so that Nixon could never be prosecuted for any of his crimes, even though many of his employees in the administration were already serving jail time for Watergate. And so the American people wondered if perhaps Nixon and Ford had made a corrupt deal in which Nixon gave Ford the vice presidency in return for this promise of eventual pardon. We'll never know, but Ford's popularity began to sink. In 1975, he was actually the victim of two assassination attempts, interestingly, both by women. The first by Sarah Jane Moore, and the second by Lynette Squeaky Fromme, who had actually been a member of the cult of Charles Manson, the Manson family cult, which had murdered actress Sharon Tate and a number of other people in 1969. And it's quite fascinating. You know, the Manson cult was only one of a large number of strange, bizarre cults that appeared in the 1970s out of the wreckage um, of the 1960s. And you could almost say Charlie Manson, who's still in jail in California, really symbolized the failure and the disillusionment after the high ideals of the 60s. But Nixon survived both of those attempts on his life, fortunately. Um, Perhaps even more popular than Gerald Ford was his wife, Betty. Betty Ford was a controversial figure in that she was an outspoken feminist. She was in favor of the 1973 Supreme Court decision Roe versus Wade, which stated that women throughout the country had a constitutional right to get an abortion. Betty Ford also supported the Equal Rights Amendment, or ERA for short. This was a very simple proposed constitutional amendment. Basically, all it said was that equal protection of the laws will not be denied to any citizen in the United States by reason of sex. And nobody was really sure what that meant or how far it would go. It was certain that it would have far-reaching consequences in employment, in education, and in family life, but it was never quite clear exactly what the effects of the ERA would be. We'll talk more about the ERA shortly. After leaving the White House, Betty Ford announced that she had been an alcoholic for many years, and she devoted the rest of her life to an institution she created called the Betty Ford Clinic, which is still in operation, and it's a place where many celebrities go for rehab. Now, in fact, women's liberation was one of the huge issues of the 1970s. On the right, you see a photograph of two feminists, Gloria Steinem and Pamela Hughes, uniting in the Black Power um, salute and bringing that energy to feminism. Gloria Steinem was a very important figure, still is. She's still active. Steinem was a journalist. She was the founder of Ms. magazine. In fact, ladies, if you like to call yourself Ms. MS period, you have Gloria Steinem to thank. Before Ms. magazine, all women had to either call themselves Miss or Mrs. Um, but it was really through Steinem's efforts that the third option, Ms., became available. And the idea was that women should not be defined by their marital status. Another very important moment in women's lib, as it was called, took place in the sports world. There was an old, kind of washed up men's tennis star from the 30s and 40s whose name was Bobby Riggs. And he began challenging the top women in tennis to play him, saying that even though he was old and over the hill, he could beat any professional women's tennis player. And he actually did beat one of the top women's tennis pros, Margaret Court. So at that point, the number one women's tennis player in the world, Billie Jean King of the United States, um, to avenge women's honor, accepted Riggs' challenge and played Riggs in a nationally televised match, which is still the highest rated tennis match in history. It was called the Battle of the Sexes, and Billie Jean King struck a great blow for women's lib by just wiping the floor with Bobby Riggs in straight sets in 1973. So, decade of a lot of change, especially for women, and also in terms of the culture in many other ways. So, the process by which Americans really became disillusioned and cynical about their government obviously went into even higher gear after Watergate. You know, at this point, many Americans had simply given up on the political system, which they saw as hopelessly corrupt. So instead of trying to change society through politics, many Americans turned within and simply focused on changing themselves using radical new techniques. For instance, new therapies appeared. There were, for example, the EST seminars. People would attend these seminars and learn how to empower themselves and become more assertive. Also, yoga became a widespread practice, of course, based in Hinduism. Out of Buddhism came the practice of Zen meditation, which became increasingly popular. And also, increasing number of Americans began to embrace what was called New Age spirituality. For example, using things like crystals, exploring past lives with the help of a psychic or a guru, Wicca, and other types of so-called earth religions. So you see that Americans have turned away from sort of the traditional icons of our culture and are embracing, in many cases, radical imports that are coming from outside the Western Christian tradition. And because of this focus on self improvement, in a famous article in 1976, the novelist Tom Wolfe dubbed the 1970s the me decade, and the name stuck. So the idea was that it's all about me. I'm not worried about the world. You know, the world can go to hell as long as I am individually, personally happy and fulfilled. Um, and in a way, you can kind of understand why people went in that direction after all the trauma of the late 1960s, the assassinations, Vietnam, new terrorist organizations, and so forth. Um, there was a sense that people were ready to forget all of that and to just, in a way, focus on having fun. Now, the 60s, really, I think, even when 60s activists were using drugs in the hippie counterculture and so forth, the 60s was always serious. I mean, Timothy Leary was genuinely trying to change the world in his own way that we may not agree with, but the goal was really to transform society. But during the me decade, the goal was to indulge myself, to be happy, to be fulfilled, um, not to not to think about what I can do for my country or the world. Um, let's see, other cultural changes in the 70s. Well, acid became kind of passe as a drug, and the most popular drug in the 1970s, for those who could afford it, was cocaine. And in a way, cocaine was ideally suited for this new lifestyle in the disco era, because you could go to your job during the day and then you could take cocaine and you could go disco all night at places like Manhattan Studio 54, and then you could go back to work the next day and repeat the process the next evening. So it was a very intense pursuit of pleasure and fun during the 1970s, and I think disco really epitomizes that. Now, I always try to give you a song that I think really captures the feel of a period in American history. And the song I've chosen for the 70s is by the group Village People, and the song is called In the Navy. So I'd like for you to go to the supplementary videos folder and watch this early music video of the Village People in the Navy. Hmm. Well, what do you think of that? I bet you never thought you'd be watching that in a history course. But I think it's very significant, actually, in talking about the changes that took place in the 1970s. Well, first of all, you see that the song is peppy, it's upbeat, and it's all about having fun, dancing, having a good time. But it really does have a political message, and you almost have to read between the lines to get it. Now, since you are all aware of these things nowadays, I'm sure you understood right away that the political message of the song was about gay identity. Believe it or not, in the 1970s, when the Village People had a string of number one hits, including YMCA, In the Navy, and Macho Man, most Americans really did not occur to them that the Village People were gay, because gay culture was still somewhat underground or confined to certain neighborhoods in certain large cities. And most people couldn't read the signs. But now, of course, um, the gay lifestyle has become very prevalent, very celebrated in the media, and you're all familiar with it. So you probably recognized right away that in this song, and really in all their songs, the Village People were trying to assert themselves as part of an emerging gay community. And so this is a new kind of politics. It's not about changing all of society. It's about asserting one's own identity as part of a subgroup in society. So we could really call this identity politics, and I think that it's very, very important in our political culture today. But also very important was the backlash against these new developments. Now, obviously, many Americans um, did not approve of the gay lifestyle as it was beginning to come out of the closet in the 1970s. And people like that found a leader in the person of Anita Bryant. Now, Anita Bryant had been a runner-up in the Miss America pageant. She was a singer, but she was perhaps best known for doing commercials for Minute Maid orange juice. She was also a conservative evangelical Christian. And when Dade County, Florida, where Miami is, passed a non discrimination ordinance protecting gays and lesbians in Dade County, Anita Bryant went into action and mounted a huge campaign among the voters. This was actually a classic progressive type of campaign. What she did was to get the voters to mount an initiative to get a referendum on the ballot so that they could repeal the anti-discrimination ordinance, and it was successful. It was totally successful, and the voters did repeal that pro-gay law. But in the long run, Anita Bryant was perhaps the best gift that gay activists could have gotten, because in a way, she gave pro-gay people someone to unite against. And so increasingly, and as the 1980s went on, you would see much more vocal, open, and organized gay activism. Another very important female conservative activist is perhaps chiefly responsible for defeating the Equal Rights Amendment. Her name is Phyllis Schlafly. She had been involved in politics for a long time, but she was also basically a housewife from St. Louis. But when it looked like ERA was going to pass, Phyllis Schlafly formed a group called the Eagle Forum, which rallied many conservative women across the country to oppose ERA. And Schlafly argued that the vast majority of American women liked their lifestyle as housewives. They loved their husbands and their kids, and that women's livers like Gloria Steinem really didn't speak for them. And partly because of Schlafly's efforts, the ERA came so close to passing but ultimately failed. It needed to get 38 states to ratify it. That's 3/4 according to the Constitution. And it got up to 35 and never advanced any farther. And so the ERA died. So what you see here, I think, is a very, very significant tide of conservative activism that begins to emerge in the late 1970s. And perhaps the most significant of these activist groups became known as the Moral Majority. And it was founded by a Southern Baptist minister named Reverend Jerry Falwell, who had a TV program on Sunday morning. I remember it well. It was called the Old Time Gospel Hour, in which Falwell would attack abortion, ERA, gay rights, and many other movements in the contemporary world that he saw as anti-Christian. And so finally, Falwell decided it was time for his followers to get into the political arena and to crusade publicly and politically against abortion, and also in favor of restoring prayer to the public schools, which had been previously eliminated by a Supreme Court decision. Now, this moral majority movement was very, very significant in a number of ways. Okay, first of all, it was the first time in American history that Baptists specifically had ever taken an active role in politics. The Baptist Church, one of its hallmarks had always been calling for strict separation of church and state, and really a kind of apathetic attitude towards politics, that Christian believers should basically stay aside from politics. But under Falwell, Baptists and other Protestant evangelicals really went into the political arena very forcefully. And also very significant, in so doing, they aligned themselves with Catholic activists like Phyllis Schlafly, who had been opposing abortion for years. And so it was because of this joint crusade that Protestant evangelicals and Catholics for the first time really began to get along and appreciate each other. So that was another effect. Third effect, I think, was that for the first time conservatives began to adopt some of the tactics that liberals had used, for instance, in the civil rights movement: nonviolent protests, mass demonstrations, civil disobedience, and so forth. Now, conservative people tend to not like to do those things, to make a fuss or to march around in the streets with a sign or whatever. But under the leadership of people like Falwell and Schlafly and Anita Bryant, conservatives began to see it as their responsibility to do the same thing as well. So I think this is really one of the lasting legacies of the 1970s, this new politicized Christian right. Well, in the 1976 presidential election, Gerald Ford was nominated for the Republicans. His opponent was, of course, Southwest Georgia's favorite son, President Jimmy Carter, who is, of course, still alive and living in Plains, Georgia, having recently survived a battle with cancer. You can still go up there to his church on Sunday mornings, and you can hear him teach his Sunday school class. Now, Jimmy Carter had been, he was a Washington outsider. He had started life in the Navy, actually, and then he moved back to Plains and he became a peanut farmer. So he was an ordinary citizen who got involved in politics and ran for governor of Georgia and won. And so after serving one term as governor of Georgia, Carter threw his hat into the ring for the Democratic nomination in 76, and it seemed like a real long shot. But actually, Carter had a lot of qualities that really matched what voters were looking for in 76. After Watergate, people wanted someone who was not a Washington insider. They wanted someone who didn't have connections in D.C. They wanted someone who was honest, and Jimmy Carter was the image of squeaky clean, small town American honesty. He was also a very devout, and is a very devout evangelical Christian. And so he seemed very sincere. He seemed like someone who might be able to clean up Washington and, in a way, restore people's faith in the government after the fall of Nixon. Also in his favor was the fact that he was kind of unconventional as a Democrat, was a fairly conservative Democrat in that he really wanted the government to balance its budget. He didn't want to do what's called tax and spend, tax people more heavily so as to create huge new social programs. And so Jimmy Carter was elected and took office in January of 1977. But it has to be said, the Carter administration was not very effective, and really almost, I think Jimmy Carter was perhaps too good of a man to be president. He wasn't a Washington insider. He didn't know how Washington worked exactly. He didn't have a lot of allies there. And he was a very moral individual, and I think didn't descend to some of the deal making that has to be done in Washington. Now, under Carter, the economy did grow gradually, but the main economic problem in the Carter administration was inflation. And that was partly because of Carter's policies. Basically, he didn't want to raise taxes to pay for the social programs we already had. You know, he didn't create a lot of big new social programs, but there was still Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security to be paid for. And so, to keep the federal budget almost balanced, the Carter administration really inflated the currency. That is, printed up a lot of new money to try to cover the books and to keep the government running without raising taxes dramatically. And that always creates inflation. But another major cause of inflation was almost totally out of Carter's control, and that was the increase in the price of gasoline. Already during the Nixon administration, there had been an energy crisis when OPEC the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, dominated by Arab oil producers, had for a time refused to sell petroleum to the United States because of our support um, for Israel. But during the Carter administration, the second energy crisis had to do with a revolution in the nation of Iran. Now, for many years, we had been supporting the Shah or King of Iran. He was one of our closest allies in the Middle East. Um, but in 1979, under the leadership of an Islamic cleric named Ayatollah Khomeini, a revolution took place which swept the Shah from power and created an Islamic state in Iran, which is obviously still the case. And so essentially, that took some of Iran's oil off the world market. But really, the Iranian Revolution in itself should not have caused gas prices to rise as they did. It was mostly panic on the oil markets that caused the spike in gas prices in 1979. And how well I remember, my dad actually, his job, he was a gas station manager. And I remember it so well. The horror uh, in our town when my dad had to raise the price of gas over $1 a gallon for the first time. That was absolutely unthinkable. Uh, well, to deal with the energy crisis, Carter retired to his retreat at Camp David, Maryland for a couple of weeks, and he met with a lot of people to try to work out a solution. And then when he finally emerged from Camp David, he went on television to present the results of his thinking there, in a speech that became known as the Crisis of Confidence speech. And I have included your last video segment is a little snippet from Jimmy Carter's Crisis of Confidence speech. So if you would, please go watch that excerpt and then come back in a moment. Well, I think from that speech you get a pretty good sense of Carter's leadership style. Carter was an honest man. He really told the truth as he saw it, and he didn't try to sugarcoat things. And so that's why in the speech he says that Americans are going to have to get used to making sacrifices, that we might not be able to have it all our own way in the world, and also admits that as president, he can't do things on his own. He needs the American people to support him and to make sacrifices if there's going to be any progress made on energy. Now, very true, very brave, very honest, but that isn't really what we like to hear, is it? We American voters like to hear the president say, oh, it's all going to be okay and you're not going to suffer at all, and leave it to me, I'll take care of it all. Um, and so you see what I mean about Carter in a way perhaps being too honest and too good to be president. He didn't tell people what they wanted to hear, and his popularity really suffered as a result. Well, one of the greatest triumphs of Carter's presidency actually had to do with Middle Eastern politics. In 1978, Carter had invited the leaders of Israel and Egypt, Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat, to join him at Camp David to try to work out a peace agreement between those two countries, and ultimately was successful. And the meeting produced what were called the Camp David Accords, in which basically Israel made some minor concessions to Egypt, and in return, Egypt endorsed Israel's right to exist, which was really a huge step forward in Arab-Israeli relations. No Arab country had ever done that before. So great achievement for President Jimmy Carter in 1978, but it was also from the Middle East, really, that Jimmy Carter's downfall would come. And again, it was the country of Iran. Basically, the Shah of Iran, the former Shah of Iran, was very sick, and Carter allowed him to come to New York City for medical treatment. In protest, a group of Islamic student radicals attacked the United States Embassy in Tehran, Iran, and took all the personnel there hostage. They later let go all of the women and all of the African Americans, whom they saw as fellow oppressed people, oppressed by the United States. But they basically kept all the white males, 52 Americans, hostage in the embassy beginning in November of 1979, what became known as the Iran hostage crisis. Well, I'll never forget this and what it did to people's morale in the country, because day after day on the news, they would have the first story would always be Iranian hostage crisis, day 3, day 17, day 110, day 270. And it was terribly humiliating for Americans, who we like to feel we have the greatest country in the world. It was terribly humiliating for us to watch our citizens being paraded around the streets, blindfolded, humiliated, and held against their will for more than a year. And so it was really Carter's failure to bring a quick resolution to the hostage crisis that doomed him in his re-election attempt. There was an attempted rescue mission, but the helicopters developed mechanical trouble in the desert, and it had to be aborted. So really, this long ongoing saga of American humiliation unfolded as the 1980 presidential election neared. Another problem for President Carter, he decided that it was necessary to stop inflation or to reduce inflation. And so, in order to do this, he reversed the earlier policy of inflating the currency and decided to tighten the supply of money. Well, this time, a massive recession resulted. As soon as the money supply contracted, the whole economy went into recession. And so this was not a recipe for Democratic victory in 1980. The Republican nominee was Republican Ronald Reagan, the former actor, the former governor of California. And so Reagan had a totally different personality from Carter. He was always bright, always optimistic, always sunny and smiling, somewhat like FDR in that way. And he did tell American voters what they wanted to hear. And it was kind of an unforgettable moment in the presidential debate of that year. At the very end, Reagan looked right into the camera and asked the American people, "Are you better off than you were 4 years ago?" And most Americans had to say no. And so Reagan won a significant victory and became president in 1981. And it was kind of ironic that the Iranians hated Carter so much that even though it was Carter who negotiated the release of the hostages, the Iranians refused to release them until after Reagan was inaugurated. So it was actually on Inauguration Day, a few hours after Reagan was inaugurated, that the hostages were released. So really, I think President Carter may have had worse luck than any other president in American history. Now, Reagan got massive support from the moral majority and the new Christian right movement. That was somewhat ironic because actually Ronald Reagan was a somewhat lukewarm Christian. After he survived an assassination attempt, it later became known that his wife, Nancy Reagan, had consulted astrologers to dictate his appointments and movements to try to prevent him from being a victim of another assassination attempt. So he wasn't exactly a heartfelt Christian. He was also the first, and to this day only, divorced person ever to be president, which may not seem like such a big deal, but it was a taboo for a long time, especially among conservative Christian voters. But they turned out for Reagan massively. Um, and also, though, another big factor in Reagan's victory was the rise of the region called the Sun Belt. And I'll come back to this, but I want to show you on the map. Now, since the beginning of the 1970s, many northern cities had gone into decline and produced what is now known as the Rust Belt, where many factories closed, steel mills, and a lot of factories began to move offshore, go to other countries. So a lot of those old blue collar jobs were lost in the Northeast. And so, what did many people there do? They began looking for opportunity down south, which was booming, partly because of the widespread availability of air conditioning, which made places like Texas and Florida much more livable. So what you get is almost like a reverse of the Great Migration. You get a lot of northerners moving down to the south and also to the southeast to places like California, Arizona, New Mexico. And so these Sun Belt states, which are growing in prosperity, are also growing in population and getting more electoral votes. And increasingly, these states, at least the southeastern states, were going Republican, starting especially with Reagan in 1980s. So this has been a very important demographic shift in American political history, and it's quite interesting that every man who's been elected president since Lyndon Johnson, with one exception, President Obama from Illinois, has been from the Sun Belt. And that just goes to show you how much power our region actually does have in American presidential politics. Well, one of Reagan's campaign promises was to cut taxes dramatically, believing that if people had more money in their pockets, they would spend more and this would boost the economy. And this message was very, very appealing to ordinary American voters. In fact, there had been a lot of grassroots initiatives in a number of states to try to cut taxes. For example, referendum in 1978 in California called Proposition 13 slashed property taxes in that state, and the voters passed it. So, in a way, this is also connected to the new mood of mistrust for government. The idea is we don't want a big government. We don't want to pay through the nose for inefficient government bureaucracies. Instead, we want you to cut our taxes, and we'll just deal with problems more ourselves. And in fact, under Reagan, the top tax rate was cut dramatically. Believe it or not, before Reagan, the wealthiest, highest earning Americans had to pay 70% of their income in taxes, and Reagan cut that to only 28%. And so people across America, in many cases, were willing to accept less government, fewer public services in exchange for tax cuts. So, for example, instead of spending a lot of money on parks that people could go to exercise or walk in, people began going to private facilities like health clubs to exercise or malls to walk around in, especially if you're a senior citizen. So, again, all of this contributed and was a result of also this feeling after Watergate that we don't trust our government. However, President Reagan's record on reducing the size of government was decidedly mixed. Now, he did cut taxes. He cut some social programs, some support for education, the environment, and so on. And he also outsourced certain tasks of the government to private contractors for the sake of efficiency. But it's quite interesting. If you look at the chart on the left, this is a chart showing budget deficits or surpluses that were run by different presidents. And you see, Jimmy Carter had something of a deficit, but not nearly as much as Ronald Reagan. It was actually President Reagan who created the modern era of deficit spending. And interestingly, that continued under his successor, George Bush. And you notice that the Democratic president, Bill Clinton, actually had a budget surplus for a while. Now, to be fair, that was largely because of the end of the Cold War, enabling Clinton to close a lot of military bases and cut arms programs. We'll talk about that in a moment. But it's quite interesting that Reagan, having promised to reduce the size of government, actually increased government deficits. Why did he do that? Well, Reagan, unlike Nixon in his later years, was a real Cold Warrior. And he really wanted to run the Soviet Union out of existence, drive the last nail in its coffin. He called it the evil empire in a very famous speech. And so, under Reagan, we embarked on a huge, massive military arms buildup with the goal of forcing the Soviets to compete with us. And Reagan knew that the Soviet economy was not in good shape and that the Soviets really couldn't afford to do that. And so essentially we were trying to make the Soviet Union bankrupt and to cause its collapse. And ultimately that is what happened. One of the major programs that Reagan started was called the Strategic Defense Initiative, better known as Star Wars. It was basically supposed to be a massive shield in which satellites would shoot down incoming Soviet nuclear missiles if they ever fired them at us. And that may sound a little bit too sci-fi or unrealistic, but it scared the living daylights out of the Soviets that we would be immune to their attack. And so they too had to try to develop such a system. And so even though the Soviets had a very liberal premier in the person of Mikhail Gorbachev, who really tried to reform the Soviet Union in the 1980s, he was unable to make any headway because of the massive spending that was forced on him by this arms race. And so ultimately, we did win the Cold War. But in order to do that, President Reagan had to spend about $1.4 trillion more than we actually took in during his administration. I remember the Reagan administration very well. I actually got to shake his hand once. And it's interesting how his reputation has grown. When he was in office, people often made fun of him. They considered him to be senile because he was the oldest president at that time. Not very intelligent, which was not fair. If you read his letters, you'll see he was a very intelligent man. But after he left office, and when the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1981, the people of Eastern Europe especially considered Reagan a hero. And gradually, his reputation really grew in the United States as it became clear that his policies had, in fact, led us to a victory of sorts in the Cold War. Well, that's the end of the course. Wait a minute, you're saying. Why is he stopping there? That was more than 25 years ago. Well, you can call me an old fuddy-duddy, but I believe that most of the major issues since the end of the Cold War, such as Islamic terrorism, the war on terror, Iraq, Afghanistan, climate change, the progress made by African American and female politicians, and so on, that all of these things are still ongoing. In a sense, the book isn't closed on them yet. and the history is still being written. So, as a historian, I don't feel competent to comment on them yet. But I hope that with our little journey through 19th and 20th century American history, you've gotten some insights that will help you as you continue to write that ongoing history.